Of courses that look at kind of what's happening in the world, whether it's a kamikaze drone taking out a tank, or I noticed just in the news there are cage armor configurations. I guess wouldn't that create the explosion further away from the armor to kind of decrease the impact? Tell me a little bit about some of those things.
Right. So, here at the schoolhouse, we help provide assessments, and we're part of the lessons learned group that goes out and looks at Europe and all the different COCOMs around the world, kind of what's going on out there, and pulling back those lessons, and we implement that into training here. As like Ukraine, the Russia-Ukraine crisis right now, their use of cages to help mitigate the UAS threat. I can't tell you how effective it is, but I don't think they would be using it if it wasn't somewhat effective. Obviously, there's limitations on what they can do with their systems, what they've got a big cage around them. But at the end of the day, it's if they believe it's useful, they're going to employ it. So that's kind of how we have to be, as adaptable to the threat as it changes over time. And that's kind of what our university focuses on, is, taking those lessons learned, taking our observations, and trying to make the most relevant curriculum we can and implement that into our schoolhouse and training our joint partners.
That's excellent. That's excellent. What about looking at magazine depth? For example, I had the honor of talking to the commanding officer of Carrier Strike Group 2 in the Red Sea. One of the things he talked about with drone defense was the need for a deep magazine. How does that pertain to kinetic versus non-kinetic defenses? Essentially, the key question, quite simply, how do you defend a swarm? We talked about precision engagement. We knocked one out. What about 20?
Right. And, kind of goes back to that cost benefit analysis and leveling the scale out a little bit between the UAS threat and our munition magazine depth and the cost of those munitions too. So, we really have to be cognizant of that. And, that's where AI can potentially help us out. But there's also other things that you mentioned before. You look at directed energy and high powered microwaves that could potentially be a quiver or an arrow in the quiver for the commander if he's faced with a situation like that. There's all obvious considerations for planning with those type of weapon systems that you gotta really be cognizant of. If not, you could be detrimental to your own force using some of that stuff. So, but the continued development and improvement through the testing and all that is really teaching us some of those lessons that those commanders will need to know when eventually they get fielded some type of high power microwave or directed energy weapon system. So.
Well, that sounds impressive. You look not just at non-kinetic or potential cutting-edge solutions, but test them in given scenarios and look at how they might be applied. You called to mind this whole question of non-kinetic. What are the advantages of that? Clearly, if you have an electromagnetic signature or signal, you could maybe knock out or disable a bunch at once.
Right, and that's when you look at high-power microwaves, one shot can take out. I couldn't even tell you how many. I guess it would depend on the power output of those particular systems, but you're saving money on munitions and stuff like that, where you'll need significant amount of munitions at a certain amount of price to engage those 20, 30, 40, UASs that you would consider a swarm in complex attacks or whatever it might be. So that's where the advantages come in with non-kinetic capabilities. EW is another prime example. That's another thing you look at for protecting any type of our critical infrastructure or bases or posts around the United States or abroad, is non-kinetic capabilities, so we don't have residual effects from those. So,
Roger that. One of the things I learned was the use of an RF signal to essentially detect and intercept the protocol of the RF signature of a drone, bounce it off a database, and then either jam or essentially take over that drone. That most commercially available drones can be identified quickly because they're part of an easy database. To what extent can you intercept that protocol, not only jam that signal, but potentially even derail it or take it over?
Right. I mean, if we understand, the signals they're operating on, that becomes fairly easy. Unfortunately, the enemy gets a vote, and they have an opportunity to adjust how they execute their tactics, techniques, and procedures, and we have to be adaptable to that. And that's where you kind of got to layer your capabilities in, between non-kinetic capability and potentially kinetic capability, or multiple levels of non-kinetic capability. So you have different types of effectors that can do different things to potentially get after that threat. So
that's excellent. And I imagine you're working on the command and control to how to integrate those. At what point do you need the non-kinetic versus the kinetic based on a given threat scenario?
right, and that goes back to kind of our machine learning and AI implementation, right, and that decision aid. Hopefully that will help tell that operator or commander, hey, the optimal solution here is this at this time, this location with this effector. So, recommend using this, and then they can make the decision, that intuition they have to make that decision. So,
Roger that. Well, the Army's really successful in some of the cutting edge leading efforts on that, especially with Project Convergence and Firestorm, taking sensor data, bouncing it off a database, and making those determinations quickly to essentially truncate the sensor to shooter time from minutes down to seconds. The Army's been all over that curve, and it sounds like you're looking at applying that to counter drone defense, which would be very significant.
oh, absolutely. I mean, counter drone, air and missile defense, the whole construct there. AI, machine learning implementation will absolutely change the landscape of how we see too in the future.
Right. Even to the Army, forward thinking. Gosh, for years there have been Army of 2020, Army of 2040, Army of 2050. The Army appears in this case to be all over the future threat scenario. Lieutenant Colonel John Peterson, thank you so much. Spoken like a scholar. Really important work. Appreciate your time. I mean, gosh, this threat is so serious right now.
Absolutely, and thank you for having me on. A great discussion. We're going to continue the fight and make sure we're getting the best training out to our service members we possibly can.
Excellent.